the media tell you about the protests in Canada. Now, despite restrictions easing across most parts of the United Kingdom, the rest of the world is a little further behind, and Canada in particular has hit the headlines in recent weeks. But what aren't the media telling us about what is happening in Canada? Today, I'm joined by award-winning journalist Trish Wood to get the lowdown on what is going on in Canada and to discuss the role of legacy media and what role it's played in prolonging the public health measures. Plus, Trish will reveal what her background as a science journalist covering the role of Dr. Fauci during the AIDS crisis in the 80s can tell us about the emerging health technocracy of today. Trish Wood is the host of the Trish Wood is Critical podcast and has a head for critical thinking and has been blowing up the conventional wisdom for decades. Her docuseries for Amazon Studios was critically acclaimed, as was her book on the follies of the Iraq War. Today, she focuses on the collapse of democratic institutions, the threat of groupthink, and hubris, and the massive failing of legacy media to report objectively. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Please do hit the share button. Thank you so much for tuning in. Trish, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing over there?
Oh, fantastic. So thank you so much. And I'm just really excited for this conversation. You've got such a varied background. It's always fantastic to meet another like-minded critical thinker. But you've been blazing a trail for some time now. Would you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been involved in for a little bit of context before we get into the matters of what's going on in Canada?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm in Toronto, Canada, which is kind of ground zero for COVID zero fanaticism. I know you know what that is, although nobody actually speaks those words out loud, but that's what's happening. But what brought me here into a place I never thought I would be, with a podcast on critical thinking, doing a lot of criticism of media and criticism of legacy media, where I existed as a high-profile, award-winning, well-paid professional for decades. It's been kind of a long, hard road. And the difference between then and now is simply this, that what I did in the past, specifically around Tony Fauci and the AIDS crisis, which I covered in the 80s. Yes, I'm that old. And what's happening now around COVID-19, I couldn't do that kind of journalism now, right? I did it for the CBC, which is our national broadcaster, like the BBC. It's an august place. I was always super proud to work. They did some of the best programming in the world. I worked on their biggest show, The Fifth Estate, which is like your panorama. I was a host of it. And I did the AIDS reporting primarily for a radio show called As It Happens, which is known around the world as a brilliant place to discuss all kinds of issues. I was the science and medicine reporter. And I was privileged then to work for a company that spent money to fly me around covering AIDS, which was a huge story. It was the medical story of the time, right? Gay men were dropping like flies. I mean, it was an unstoppable death sentence hitting a very specific group of people at the beginning, so we thought. And they had kind of rallied into this group of patients who wanted to have some power over their own destiny as they kind of shot through the medical system, right? Which was super admirable. So I covered that. And the focus of their attention then was primarily Tony Fauci. And I don't know if you know this or not, but they used to chain themselves to the fence at the National Institutes of Health with Fauci as a murderer signs around their neck because he was making decisions that they didn't agree with and not listening to clinicians who were desperately trying to keep these guys alive. What I learned then from attending multiple AIDS conferences was that every single year, somebody would come to the conference, some hotshot, and say, we're going to have a vaccine within a year. That was promised every year. It was the headline every year after year. Gina Collette at the New York Times, vaccine within a year. And we still don't have one. But that was always the focus. And the guys who were dying were saying, well, that's cool. We'd really like that. But by the way, how do I keep my partner alive who is massively dying right now of Kaposi sarcoma, which is a kind of cancer that gay men, that anybody with AIDS got at the time. So what was happening was that clinicians, not unlike today, people who are fighting to get early treatment to COVID, people with COVID, clinicians then were coming up with ideas through their clinical practice of what was actually working. And one of the things that worked was a drug called Bactrim, which is a sulfa drug like an antibiotic, pretty benign drug, been around for years, that they were using to treat as prophylax PCP pneumonia, which is pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. It was a presenting kind of infection for people with AIDS and had a very, very poor prognosis. So this drug Bactrim was working. The doctors were seeing it was working. It was working. It was keeping people alive, right? So the doctors went to see Tony Fauci at NIH, and he refused to put out a bulletin suggesting that clinicians should be using this drug. They were using it off-label, obviously. And a guy I knew quite well named Michael Callan, who was one of the leaders of the movement, lovely guy, and he'd been alive with AIDS for a really long time, like I think 11 years or something. He also went to see Tony Fauci with Joe Sonnabend, one of the clinicians who had seen the results from Bactrim. They begged him to make this bulletin. He would not do it. I later on was doing another story and went myself to see Tony Fauci and ask him why he did not and would not release this drug. And his argument then, although the story's been rewritten, but I was there, and this is what he said to me, and this is what he said to Michael Callan. He said, I want more studies, better studies. You know, we have to do the gold standard kind of research, which sounds perfectly reasonable. But when people are dying and there's no other alternative for them, why not let them decide what they want, right? So Michael Callan died of AIDS, I think, in the early 90s. I believe I got the last interview with him. I remember it very clearly. We were sitting in a kind of a fancy hotel penthouse in New York where we were filming the interview for a documentary. And of all the things that happened to Michael in his life, and it was a pretty interesting life, especially as an AIDS activist, he was absolutely bemused by the idea that Fauci would not relinquish this rigid way of thinking and allow this drug or send a bulletin out that would tell doctors that this drug could be used and maybe should be used in this case. And, it was kind of a sad moment to hear this guy who'd worked so hard to save his tribe, gay men with AIDS, ruminating on the idea that he couldn't budge. He couldn't budge Tony Fauci. So I carry that with me into the way that COVID-19 is being handled and covered. Again, clinicians are saying ivermectin works. They're being attacked for doing so. That terrible tweet that was put out, I can't remember if it was FDA or CDC. I think it was FDA. You're not a horse, you're not a cow, suggesting to people that ivermectin is a veterinary product, right? And it's not. It was a Nobel Prize winning drug invented for people. And yes, there is an animal version, the same way there is an animal version of Prozac. We don't say Prozac is a veterinary drug, right? But I'm like, here we go again. Like, why can't we just have open discussions without the subterfuge, right? And just to put a pin in the Fauci Bactrim story, the calculation is that between 17,000 and 30,000 people died as a result of not having access to Bactrim during that time. He eventually approved it and pushed it forward, but it was like a year and a half to 2 years later. People waited. And so I see a similar mindset playing out here. Also, the reliance on vaccines as the savior to kind of ride in and fix a problem, and not looking at treatment in the way that it should be looked at and should have been looked at 2 years ago.
Well, I think the irony there is that, from what we've seen in the last 2 years is, the length of time it's taken to produce vaccines has obviously been radically reduced. But many of the traditional or typical trial protocols that would be followed in the development of a vaccine have been foregone under this emergency conditions, which you could very much argue are equally applicable to any treatment or drug that could be used to ease symptoms or prevent symptoms or make a difference. But but many of the drugs that would be repurposable drugs, they've been through the safety profiling, yet we've still not seen this approval. So I can absolutely see those parallels. We're 20, 30 years on, and this is still a problem.
Yeah, I know. And the interesting thing about, what you just said about it is the idea that that there is a kind of a mindset about this. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist per se, and I don't think you need to be if you try to explain how this happens. I think there is, I think Fauci has a lot to answer for. I've thought that for a long time, but there also is an element of groupthink in science that we don't want to accept exists. It's as if they are up on the mountain delivering this kind of perfect information and that there's debate about it. Actually, no, that's not how it works. People who are doing research that fits the current narrative of the NIH, those are the ones who get funded. It's harder for outliers to get funded. There is groupthink. And when there's groupthink, then massive mistakes can be made. And I will tell you what I'm thinking today, especially sitting in a country that went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve to what is now bordering on martial law in certain areas of the country. That's a real thing, right? They're threatening to take bank accounts away from people who have supported the protest. I mean, it's just, I can't even believe we're here. It's really, it's like, it's incremental, right? So you're kind of like, yeah, that happened. It's sort of weird, but how much more weird can it get? And then the next day it's like, oh, that was weird. Right. And now we are literally at the leader of apparently a free country, a Western democracy, clamping down in a way that is historically, it's not been done before by this particular act, right? Historically significant, and some people are kind of cheering it on too, right? So the idea that he would go where he is now when he could have resolved what he sees as the problem by simply addressing the idea of mandates, which are falling around the world. They certainly are where you are, and in Scandinavia too, and various blue states in America, blue states too, and red states, obviously. But he won't do that. That suggests that there's also something else going on that's corrupted the scientific discussion. The only thing that should matter about mandates really is whether they work or not. And we know that the vaccines are failing to prevent transmission with Omicron. Israel data shows that very clearly. I don't even think anybody's even arguing that credibly anymore. I might be wrong, but I don't think they are. So if that's the case, then how do you justify the mandates? And then what the corollary is, how do you justify this kind of a clampdown on civil liberties over mandates for a pharmaceutical product that's likely not even really doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? This is the sort of clown world we live in Canada right now.
Well, absolutely. What I find interesting is that piece that some people are cheering it on, and actually some of the footage we've seen is, I mean, you see some of the people with the signs saying "Go home" to the truckers, and it's this hijacking, I think, of the greater good. This extremist kind of paternalist, it's like the really rigid, controlling, paternalistic notion that mummy and daddy know best. We are the authorities. We're doing it for the greater good of the nation. Therefore, we need these truckers to go home, and we need you to join us because they over there are not, acting in accordance with the will of the Canadian people. And we've seen this divide and conquer approach unfold everywhere. In fact, the feature of one of our latest episodes has been on that notion of how the media has propagated that divide and conquer. Is that something that the media has played a role in Canada? Are you see, because from our perspective, we've seen some of the speeches that Trudeau is making that is demonizing the protesters, and in a very inhumane way, classifying people in certain ways. It seems very unreasonable. What's been your perception on the ground in Canada of the way that the media has done this?
Yeah, well, thanks for doing that show, by the way, because that's really an important piece of this, in my view. And just to give you some idea how far Canada has fallen, being led by a prime minister who yesterday in Parliament accused a Jewish woman whose family either fled or she's a survivor, I think, of Holocaust survivors, right? There's some connection there. Forgive me for not knowing more about it. Her last name is Lanceman. Accused her for questioning what he was doing as someone who stands with people who have Nazi flags or some smear along that. I mean, imagine that. Like he should, like in a healthy democracy, he would not have survived politically the day, right? But what we all know now is that smears, based on what I was just saying a minute ago about vaccine mandates and science, and are they working? Does the vaccine work properly against Omicron? But when you don't have, not that they ever justified what they were doing with actual data. They didn't. They never told us what they were basing it on, because a lot of the stuff they did was not supported by data. But for them to justify what they are doing and what they are continuing to do with only a playbook of smears and demonization is, I mean, this is literally dictator stuff. You know, Bill Maher wasn't wrong when he said what he said about our prime minister. And you know, here you have an important late night talk show host, probably more left of center than not, right? Talking about a left of center prime minister in a Western democracy as if he were literally Hitler for what he was saying. He accused the truckers and the people who supported them of holding unacceptable views. That's the phrase. Like, how can you be a leader with any historical context and not understand how inflammatory that phrase is? It's like, okay, so who is the person who decides, you know, what the acceptable views are? I mean, it's just shocking. And he also called them, you know, a small fringe minority, which is absolutely not true. This is a huge, huge movement. So he's reduced to justifying his behaviors with smears of Nazism. And I mean, he pulled the old misogyny one out, which is hilarious since one of the leaders of the movement is a woman. You know, I mean, it's just, and if you go there, that one of the great little tents down there is a bunch of Sikh guys who've come to prepare Sikh food for the truckers. Like, it's really, it's not like super multicultural. It's quite multicultural though. And there's no whiff of any of the things there was like a flag, one flag. I mean, he describes the protests as if this is a meeting of Hitler Youth or something. It's absolutely absurd and dishonest. It is dishonest. And for me as a Canadian, we have a parliamentary system that's supposed to stop this stuff, right? It's failing. We had Jagmeet Singh, who is the leader of the New Democratic Party, kind of on the fence-ish about whether he was going to vote to approve the Emergencies Act, right? There might be some quid pro quo. He might get something and then he'll vote. Like, either something's wrong or it's not, right? Mm-hmm. And if the parliamentary system is now allowing for negotiation around whether or not to put the boot heel on protesters who have legitimate reasons for protesting, then we've lost it, right? We don't have a democracy. What are people supposed to do if the media is not listening and the politicians aren't listening? You asked about the media, and I'll tell you about it unless you wanted to jump in with something there.
Well, I think that this piece around the Emergencies Act that we discussed on the show on Monday, actually, I mean, we have to almost laugh at some of the things that are coming forward, but we can't laugh. It's because it's real. This notion that your bank accounts can be inspected, effectively martial law can be enacted. These things are very, very important and very real issues. But they are being, well, I think we can talk about the media, because the media is many ways the flag bearer for many of these things, the torch bearer, which it feels like we've just. I still wake up every day and think one day I'm going to wake up and realize it was all a dream, and it's just been, I got knocked out and I'm in the coma and none of this is real. But every day I pinch myself and know it is real. And then, like you say, something else comes up. You think, what next? Literally, what next?
I know.
What rational minds can sit on the sideline and say, well, this is all reasonable? You can't.
No, you absolutely can. And here, I think you can make a direct correlation between how long lockdowns have happened, how fierce the push was to vaccinate every living thing in the country, to how captured the media is, right? And this has been a double whammy for me, because I was a journalist for a while, then I wrote a book about the Iraq War, then I became a true crime producer, and that's what I mostly did, primarily because it gave me, I was a single mother for a while, and it gave me more control over my schedule than being in news, right? So I believed in the news business. I knew it was left of center, and sometimes things went awry, but I never, people would say, oh, Trish, obviously the government is controlling what you're doing. And I'd say, actually, literally, no. Like I never felt any political pressure on anything we ever did, their left or right criticism. That feels like it's gone. I don't know who these people are. We had a CBC host, and a good one, a smart woman, an excellent interviewer, a tough interviewer, say on national TV the other day, the protests aren't violent, but it feels like a threat. It's a threat, providing no evidence, right? This is all some kind of, is it Matthias Desmet's mass formation psychosis affecting them? I don't know. Or is it that I do believe there's a connection between what's happening in the media now and woke ideology, because both things require a suspension of rational thinking, right? I think one may be carried over into the other or something. And that the same way woke journalists will say, yeah, we don't have to be objective because we serve a higher purpose, right? Everything we do now has a social justice agenda, that they're using the same mindset to say, well, we're just trying to save lives. So, that they can do whatever they want in public health, and we will support that because we're just trying to save lives. Don't ask too many questions about fairness or democracy. We're just going to push that. And now I feel like I see these insane, they're insane, of people writing stories about a guy who has been double jabbed and boosted, and he's in the hospital with COVID. And look at how great the vaccines are. And I'm sort of like, what? It's a tautology about it. Like, oh, well, if I didn't get the vaccine, I'd be dead. Well, you don't know that.
Yes.
Right. But the media, and you guys at the Daily Mail, let me just tell you about the Daily Mail, which has smartened up. But like a year ago, they were doing exactly what we did here, which is these lurid headlines about 21-year-old man with no COVID comorbidities dies of COVID. And then they show a picture of him, and he's like 500 pounds.
Exactly. Yeah.
And probably diabetic too, right? But they save that. They assume you're a clickbaiter. You're going to read the headline. Then they bury what's really going on in the middle of the article. So what do you say to those journalists who are doing that? Are they doing it for a greater good? Do they not understand how scary this is? I don't know. But to answer your question about Canadian media, it's as dire as I think it has ever and could ever been. It's like the run up to a war that everybody wants, only worse, right? Yeah.
I think, well, the interesting observation I've got here, and this came up recently as well, is that you've got the legacy media painting that picture. They're telling the story of that one flag and portraying the whole as a reflection of that one flag. But on the flip side, we also now have people live streaming on location, almost 24/7. There is people are now starting to see the disconnect between what the media is saying and what's actually going on. Case in point, in London recently, we had a big protest there. The BBC say hundreds of people gathering, and I was there live streaming, doing a 360, showing the fact that the tens of thousands of people there saying to the screen, "Watch the news tonight," and say they'll say there's hundreds of people. People are now seeing that what the media is saying versus. And you see the carnival atmosphere, the peaceful atmosphere that whilst it may not be completely multicultural, but you see people from all walks of life. Yeah. And I saw a video this morning from a Canadian pilot who was incredibly well spoken, clearly very intellectual, with a very sensible message about the situation. So there's that disconnect that I do wonder, at what point the penny's just going to drop, because there has to be some bursting of that cognitive dissonance when you have that divergence between what one arm in the media and what the other is saying. But perhaps it is that mass formation bit. It's the deference to authority, because if you've got the logo of the known media entity versus the lone live streamer, who do you? It's very complicated.
I think what you just said is really smart. I'm learning a lot. When I started the podcast, I didn't have social media at all, didn't like it, still don't really like it, but need it, obviously. I wasn't tech savvy. I'm still not tech savvy. Didn't know what a live stream vlogging thing even was, right? But I'm coming to really love and admire that, because the only truth really being told about the protests in Ottawa right now are coming from these vloggers. There's a guy named Viva Fry, who if you're not following him, you should. Massive following. And he's a lawyer from, I believe he's in Montreal. He goes there, he just walks around live streaming the thing. Right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't edit it. He's not working around Nazi flags that are there. Like, he's just like showing without editing what's happening. And I've come to understand now that in this new world, that these people doing this journalism are to be loved and protected and supported above all else, even in a way above podcasters, right? Because we can pick our guests, we can edit, right? But when you're walking around a situation like that, live streaming, right? You're showing what's actually happening with no editorial comment.
Indeed.
So I think this is a thing that, we've got to, I fear the day that maybe they'll go after them one day too for something. They'll find a way, especially with this new money thing that Chrystia Freeland, by the way, who is the woman who in the cabinet who announced this weird and really seriously overreaching new monetary grab, which essentially gives the banks instructions to grab the bank accounts of people connected to the convoy, right? There's no legal way around it. It's fiat, right? You can take their money. The definition of who that applies to is loosey-goosey. I mean, it's really here's what is a tragedy about her. She was a journalist before. You think she might get it. And her family, I believe, fled the Ukraine or something. She fled tyranny, right? And here we are. So, you mentioned the disconnect. How do you explain the disconnect between the people, I think like me and probably you? I'm not particularly conservative. I'm sort of libertarian, but not really. I don't know what I am. I used to be a lefty. Now I can't even think about that. But the two tribes and this kind of, I think, enlightened middle, which is what we are, hopefully we'll be the ones who save the day somehow. But they're so entrenched now that they even have two realities, right? Like, I'm going to assume that Miss Freeland actually believes that the people with the bouncy castles and the good will in Ottawa are actually terrorists. That's how they're treated, like terrorists, right? I mean, she must actually believe that. And if she believes that, then she does have a pretty serious cognitive issue, right? So are people believing false things because they're being filtered through some ideological sieve or something that distorts what comes in? I mean, I don't understand. At the end of the day, I believe in people, right? I'm like Anne Frank. I think people are good at the end of the day, regardless of what happens. And I don't understand how they can be doing this and justifying it the way they are with lies, smearing working class people. I feel this is a kind of a class war too, that's been a long time coming here, the way it happened in the States with them all being called deplorables, right? I think that's what's happening here too now. And I just, honestly, I'll tell you, Dan, I don't get it.
No.
I don't get it. Yeah.
No, I mean, if you've ever seen the Stanford prison experiment, there's, this situation where Professor Philip Zimbardo created the conditions where half the group were prisoners and half were wardens. And it was a fictional scenario where they did some mental health screening before the event happened, and they kicked off the experiment. And very quickly, people all took on the roles of the different functions. So some of the prisoners became aggressors, but some of them became victims. But very quickly, some of the wardens became authoritarian and aggressive and controlling. The challenge was that Zimbardo was the prison warden. He was the chief warden. He was supposed to be monitoring the experiment, but he ended up becoming part of the experiment. And it wasn't until a third party who came and said to him, "You've gone too far. You're in this now. You're no longer an observer."
Yeah.
That they ended the experiment, and almost instantly that dissonance all broke down. And when the participants were interviewed about the way that they played out during the experiment, They almost couldn't recognize who they were under those conditions. So I've referenced this several times, and actually I've reached out to Professor Zimbardo. He's 90 years old now. I'm hoping to have the opportunity to speak to him, because I'd love to get to understand the parallels. Because whilst this isn't a social experiment, or it might start to feel like one based on what we've talked about, but there is a situation where the conditions created this situation where you have people playing the victim and we have people playing the authoritarian leader. And when it's over, when it gets to that point, will people look back and think, who was I in that moment? People would never have guessed Trudeau or the various other leaders around the world would take this approach. But here we are witnessing it in extremist form. It's quite peculiar.
Well, and Laura Dodsworth, who I'm sure you know, what was the name of her book?
State of Fear.
Thank you, State of Fear. She said something really interesting to me when we had her on. She said, it isn't the totalitarianism that freaks her out, although it does. It is the acceptance of it so easily and so quickly that freaks her out. And that really struck a chord with me. It's true. People are accepting things that if you said to them 2 years ago, would you ever sign off on this? They're saying, oh my God, are you kidding me? It is literally 2 weeks to flatten the curve to authoritarian rule in Canada now. That's kind of where we are, right? So the other thing I'm interested in knowing, and maybe you'll figure it out one day and can let me know, is why some people, obviously like you and I, and many others, weren't affected by this in the same way, why we didn't buy into it. I always just say, well, I was reading the data and looking at John Ioannidis and understanding why Fauci's version of how many people would die from COVID was wrong, because the fraction was wrong, because we didn't know how many people, I was just doing all that stuff, right? Plus with my background, I knew to be skeptical of him. But why do you think certain people are kind of immune to the hysteria that's happened around COVID-19 and the policies? Here I am interviewing you now, but I want to know what you think about that.
Yes. Well, I mean, I asked the same question of Matthias Desmet when he was on the show, and the same with David Charalambos, and they've been asking themselves these questions, as has Laura, actually, and Laura's due to be back on the show again soon, so I'll ask the same of her. But my take on this, and interesting what Matthias said, is actually the higher the intellect, or the more professional position that they are in, they tend to be operating in environments that are very much process and structure orientated, where the kind of critical thinking element is almost redundant in many ways. It's a mechanical process driven world that we live in, so that there's an element of not using our mind effectively to ask what's going on. I mean, to me, there's no single answer. David calls it, when people believe that there is a single answer, he calls it the single cause fallacy. But it's a complex yarn ball, really. There's so many. There's a multi-dimensional piece. There's the woke piece you've mentioned about this cultural trends, cultural safetyism, this rise for convenience, which leads into the kind of more paternalistic way. You've got the kind of rise of global philanthropism, capitalism. All of these things play a role in creating the conditions for what we're experiencing. But I agree with you, how quickly people become accustomed to it, and how quickly people comply without question. And it comes down to that deference of authority as well. People want to trust in the leaders. But for those of us, I think, well, here's an interesting, those of us, I mean, if I look at myself, I've always had what I describe as a healthy skepticism of authority. And,
me too.
I mean, but where did that come from? Because I can remember it like at 7 or 8 years old, as a child. I honestly remember. I remember seeing on the television for the first time politicians jeering at each other on these green leather benches, these grey-haired men in grey suits. I was thinking, surely that's not how the world is run. As an early child, I thought that. But then also, I think I'm a creative individual, someone who assimilates lots of ideas. Therefore, I'm always evaluating lots of different perspectives. It comes by my nature. But by the same token, I know plenty of creatives who on this have just been completely blind to it. People who even people in my network who are independent journalists who have just been blind to it. And you journalists, you're asking questions,
I know.
curiosity, so I don't know. There's no simple answer to that, but I think in years to come we will start to figure that out. And I think that there's a book by Jamie Bartlett called The People versus Tech, where he explores the use of behavioral science and big data, and the role of those elements in democracy, but also the role it plays in shaping our worldview. And I think
that sounds useful. That sounds like a really useful book. Yeah.
Absolutely. We won't just paint a picture of what's happened in the last 2 years. It will show you why certain elections have been won in the way that they have. And it's just fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that in all of this that really has been driving me is, and I see this in other people too. Martin Kulldorff is one, obviously Jay Badich, I'm sure you have, all these same people. Anne Bauer is another one who, if you haven't interviewed, you should. She's a novelist who looks at the pandemic through with a novelist's eye. And she's a really interesting take on it. But for me, what keeps my nervous system revved kind of at 11 constantly is the acceptance of radical cruelty toward people, right? Justified by this, if it saves one life nonsense. Like, did you ever think that we would be telling people to say goodbye to their loved ones on an iPad and cheering that on, and that hospitals would go along with it, and that nurses would be okay with it, and that the media would never it's like torture. And I remember when the Queen even was mourning, and remember that shot of her sitting all alone in the church while I guess Boris was partying while she was sitting. That's the timing of that. It's really bad. Right. But here is this frail old woman. That's not huge. But the British story that really stuck out for me was the Arthur Lab and Joe Hughes story, which I actually did a commentary about. His family, who he was. He was beaten to death by his crazy stepmother. And a relative had tried to go over and rescue him from this situation that proved fatal. And the cops said, that will violate COVID rules. And if you go over there and rescue him, we are going to charge you. Like that's like Stasi level. Like, you cannot rescue an abused child because COVID. So those are the little kind of indices that I've been cataloging for 2 years in my own head. And has really driven I'm tired. I'm tired of COVID. I'm tired of talking about it. I'm tired of being mad about it. I want my life back. I want to think about art and dance and lipstick and pretty shoes again. All the stuff and dogs, all the things that make my life worth living, and my children, my husband. But while you're in this and fully understanding what's at stake and the darkness that has existed for so many people for so long, I'm also a recovering addict. I have 21 years of sobriety, which I'm really grateful for. And we get that by working a program through a 12-step group, and they shut those down. And shutting down 12-step means people die. And public health doesn't know that. Seriously, like the fentanyl overdoses in my community right now are off the charts. 6 people a day in British Columbia, Canada are dying of fentanyl overdoses, right? Way more than COVID. And yet they shut the meetings down. They think, you can get the appropriate level of fellowship on a Zoom call. That's absolute garbage. Of course you can. But so my head gets kind of like, so do addicts not matter? Like, why are their lives less important? How does public health not know? Public health should know all about 12-step meetings because they keep millions of people alive every day in the world, right? Best thing since sliced bread. And did they ask anybody what would happen if they shut down meetings? Why didn't they say, well, you can have 5 people or 10 people or maybe do 3 meetings? Like, none of that. It was just taping over playgrounds. Schools here were shut for a long time. The teachers' unions behaved monstrously here about it, never offering actual legitimate science, right? But keeping kids out of school with inflated numbers now coming out of depression and suicide and all kinds of things with our children, masking of children. Like, it's hard to exist in the world as an empathetic human being and watch this stuff go on in the name of what is it, like saving one life or the greater good? The greater good is the terrible phrase used by you know who, you know when, the thing we're not allowed to talk about in the context of COVID, but I'll say it, not the Holocaust, but what happened before, the years before was all about, it was public health, right?
Yep.
That's what was happening. And we're not, people get mad when I say it, although I have discussed it with people who say, no, go ahead, including Holocaust survivors. And I'm not saying it's Holocaust. That was a different level thing. But I am saying that science and medicine were the first people to sign on with the Nazi Party, and not psychopaths, like not the Joseph Mengele. We know why they do it. They're bonkers, right? The bigger question for me is how a group of established, esteemed medical and scientific people got suckered into a narrative that eventually became a disaster, right? And I think that we have to talk about that. We can't be told by people that we can't use that analogy, because you know what? If we don't use that analogy and if we don't look at it responsibly and without hyperbole, then what is the point of saying never again, right? Like, I'm not saying that's where we're headed, but I do think that what happened with the science and medical and public health bureaucracy in like 1933, I think was maybe the year it began. I have to go back and look, but is not unlike some of the thinking and talking that we've heard around COVID-19. And we have to look at it. Don't we have to look at it? Like
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that the human behavior element, certainly we can look at. It's the precursors to that extreme endpoint. It doesn't, it's the boiling frog. It doesn't happen immediately. The atrocities of the past weren't overnight occurrences, in the same way that there's no overnight success story in business. It's a series of repeat actions taken by multiple people over time that lead to the outcome. And I think the comparison here is what we can see as some of the early stages. And you're absolutely right. We don't know where it's heading, but we should be able to talk about the human behavior elements, and because you can see the comparisons, the classification of people, which we've already talked about, the dehumanization, the suppression and politicization of science. The greater good part, I think, is a really important point, because I actually do think that's a broader, going to your previous question about what drives people to comply with these things, and why do some people see it and others don't. I do think there are cultural trends, and I think one of the pieces is this notion of the greater good. And there's some very noble intent behind social justice. There's some very noble intent behind doing things for society and for the collective interest. But when that intent becomes hijacked for other means, which is very easy to do, and I commentated on this last year, saying you can pretty much put "this is for the good of others" in front of anything, and with enough conviction, and the action becomes viable. And I think that's what we've seen. I know the term Bill Gates has been politicized, but he talks about creative capitalism. If you look at his videos on this, he actually talks about how doing things for good in the name of profit is a business model. There's a fantastic book by Anangio Dardis called The Winners Take All. He's written an entire book on this notion of philanthropy capitalism, which is all about the notion of doing the greater good for society, but it's really about filling your pockets. And what we can talk about similarly is those corporate interests. Most people won't dispute that. Even the hardest of critiques of those who are taking the antithesis position here will acknowledge at least that there are conflicts of interest. But again, that seems to be overridden by this notion that it's all for good. And
I think that's really, really smart. I was reading the other day, I probably like you, I go down multiple rabbit holes every day and end up reading something going, oh my God, that's really happening. And one of the things I discovered a couple of weeks ago, there's a whole body of academic literature that started bubbling up around 2014 with study abstracts with headlines like, authoritarian government is actually a good thing when battling climate change, right? So there is and has been kind of bubbling around, the laptop class, whatever we want to call them, certainly the educated bureaucracy, that the end justifies the means if the problem is big enough, right? And they're going to do that with climate change, no question. And they've certainly been doing that here, that the end justifies the means if the problem is big enough, right? So they made the problem big enough by scaring everybody with crazy, crazy media reporting. We had flashing red lights on our TV, case numbers, which were test results, but like 50,000, And you couldn't get when you go to the store, and the store would have little arrows for walking a certain way and wear your mask and, sanitize. 6 months ago, if I went into a store to buy something, I would be, virtually attacked by someone with a squeeze pump of hand sanitizer that I didn't want, right? So all of these things were building up this massive, massive scare campaign around it to elevate the threat. I'm not saying COVID didn't kill people, it did. But I actually think we could have saved more people by focusing on the vulnerable and letting everybody else sort of go on with their lives. But that's maybe another show. But they made it big, and the media helped them make it so big that it opened the door that almost anything that was proscribed as a mitigation effort, no matter how deadly it might be for a subset of the population, was acceptable because the threat was big, right? So we're going to, they're saying climate change is an existential threat. So once you've labeled it that way, then you can do anything really to try to mitigate it. And it's kind of like what Trudeau is doing with the truck protesters. Once he calls them terrorists, right, and insurrectionists, then he can do all kinds of stuff. It opens the door to all kinds of extreme measures, like grabbing people's bank accounts for sending them $50. Anything he wants, because he's elevated the threat so much, right? That seems to be how they're getting away with this stuff.
Well, in the language of disuse, he's literally created an emergency out of it, an emergency, and actually used talking about emergency acts, for a peaceful demonstration. It's and the idea that. And this is a threat to us all, really, actually, because in the UK right now, we've had a piece of legislation passing its way through Parliament, the policing bill, which is a radical piece of legislation that could seriously harm the ability to peacefully protest. But there's this vague language around how protests can disrupt ordinary public life. But the reality is protests are designed to disrupt in their nature. That's the reason why they have to be disruptive is because the ordinary means of communication to get a message through have failed or broken down. So where the democratic process isn't working, the media isn't working, so the people are forced to take direct action, and as a result, of course, there's going to be some disruption. But you can't call that a public emergency. I mean, yes, if like the hospital service collapsed because there were so many protesters that ambulances couldn't travel, fair enough. But no one is talking about doing that, and there's common decency amongst the protesters. I always encourage people, go to a protest, even just to talk to them, talk to protesters to see actually they're the kind of people you want to hang out with, because they're actually the ones that want to do good in the world. But I digress slightly. But I think this is important. Now, I suppose my question leading off this is, where is the protest now? The trucker protest. Where's it going to go?
Yeah.
But ultimately, beyond that, what's the ultimate destination? Where's Canada heading?
Yeah. So they're both good questions. I talk to the protesters pretty frequently. And yesterday morning, Tamara Leach, one of the organizers, was quite optimistic. She did overnight release a video in tears, suggesting she thought she would be arrested soon. So, they may be ramping up. There's supposed to be a vote. We'll see if anybody in the opposition parties have any courage at all. I will say this to you. If they don't have the courage to vote against this thing, which, by the way, it's in... The power is granted now, even before the vote. So it's in effect now, right? And then there's a vote. But if the opposition parties go along with this because of political favor, whatever, that's the end of democracy, right? We can't have that. So there's talk that they're going to go in and try to get them out of there somehow. I think that if they deploy big forces against the protesters in Ottawa, everybody there has got a cell phone. I mean, does the Prime Minister really want that scene of them going in and arresting the guy running, the Sikh food stand or the bouncy castle or the guy running the sauna or the truck driver from Saskatoon who's just really wants to be able to feed his kids and not have to get a vaccine to do it. I mean, does he really want that scene? Because I predict that could be, that's my prediction. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but it could be the end of his government. I hope it would be condemned, even though the media might not condemn it, sadly. So we're really in a kind of an up in the air. Anything can happen. The weather's getting bad. There's a big storm forecast for tonight and tomorrow, which will make getting there for certain people. I know people are going to go there to stand with the protesters, but driving there in this weather might pose a bit of a problem. I think we're expecting like 30 centimeters of snow, icy roads. So that's kind of a drag. But so there's that. Everybody's really on edge. Everybody's frightened. The doxing of the people who gave to the Give Send Go by the media, by the way, the Canadian media were calling people on that list. And they were saying, well, we just wanted to find out why they supported them. You know what? They could walk right down to the protest and ask that question in person of people who are comfortable. But doxing, and then there were threats over the doxing, say the truckers are violent. The people who've been doxed are getting threats, right? It's nuts. So that's that. And where's Canada going? The mandates are going to fall. And I think I want to leave your international audience with this idea, regardless of what you think of the trucker protest. Understand this. Mandates are falling around the world. All Trudeau had to do was drop the mandates, right? Or come out and meet and look like a statesman and recognize all Canadians, just not the ones who vote Liberal, and say, yeah, we're on it. We get it. The science is changing. And, and in a week, we're going to do that. He could have done that. So why didn't he do that? Like that is the ugly underbelly of this whole move by him, that he had a chance to bring the country together, to celebrate these people who had the courage to drive across the country with the flags waving in overpasses. People were weeping with gratitude to the truckers. And the one protest I went to, the two kind of mental states were either absolute elation that people could finally say what they wanted, or tears that they were so grateful to the truckers. So that's a real thing. And that's not going to go away. And I think the move now here, from my perspective, is to make sure if they drop the mandates and this thing does not blow up into a nightmare and a constitutional crisis, which it sort of is already, that we have to, here and in Canada and around the world, we have to find a way to not let this happen ever again. Public health should never have this kind of power ever again. We won't survive another bout of this. We will split apart, and the critical thinkers will end up living in one place, and the people who want to be oppressed and dominated and told what to do will live in another place. I think the center, to quote Joan Didion, the center is not going to hold. And I think we have to start thinking politically what we can do about it.
I totally agree, and I think again, thinking about the undercurrents and the trajectory that have underpinned what we've witnessed over the last couple of years of really, COVID has brought it to the tip. We've seen the tip of the iceberg with COVID and the response to COVID, but actually those mechanisms were already in process, and it's a very complex. It's a very complex equation, but society has been heading on this trajectory for a while now, where we live in an age of convenience. People want things done for them on demand. It's easier to have decisions made for you than it is to make your own decisions, and that's a cultural problem that takes us on this trajectory where this kind of health technocracy or more broader technocracy arises, because the technocrats have the answers, and the rest of us can just get on with our lives as long as it's in accordance with the rules and regulations that have been set out for the greater good. And this is a cultural problem. I do agree with you that the center is likely to be the place that breaks, and that we can't allow that to happen. That's going to be deeply fractious. But on the same token, I do think these things have created the conditions. It's creating a tipping point. There will be a threshold point, and that's my belief, And for myself personally, this has been a life-changing experience. Witnessing this from first witnessing from the sidelines and then becoming an active participant. In terms
Look at
of
you. Look at how important this podcast is. Your children, you have young children, right?
I have a 5-month-old baby boy. He has no idea what's going on in the world.
Well, no, but you know what? 15, 20 years from now, when he's in university and studying this absolute fiasco, this complete suspension of critical thinking, the groupthink of science and public health that's destroying people's lives, he can say, my dad did something. He'll be proud of you for that. Yeah. My kids thought I was nuts. They don't anymore. They're now... They figured it out, but at first they were embarrassed by mom. But that's not new. They're embarrassed by me a lot on other things.
Like I said, everyone has a threshold point, and I think we're moving toward. We're heading towards that point. I think, and I think this will be the catalyst for a transformational decade of change, and that I think we all have a role to play in helping bring that along. But life is helping it along in some ways, as hard as it may be to witness. It is creating the conditions for change. Trish, this has been an extremely powerful conversation. I had the great privilege of listening to some of your content before today's episode in preparation for our conversation. I'd love you to take a moment just to share a little bit about your show and where people can find out about the conversations that you've been having.
Oh, thank you. Well, I will say this while saying thank you to you for what you're doing. It's so important. But so the show is Trish Wood is Critical. I started it to try to look at COVID and other issues through the lens of critical thinking, which I learned, as an investigative journalist. And it's morphed. Like every week I say, I'm going to stop talking about COVID, but then I can't, right? I mean, there's no bigger story in the world.
Same. I can't let go. Yeah.
I know. It's like, but I know it's important. And here's what keeps me going. Is that, like you, I'm sure the letters I get from people saying, you're keeping me sane. I have people literally saying, you're keeping me alive. I've had a couple of people who were suicidal, who felt nobody would listen to what they were saying. Nobody was thinking what they were thinking. They felt alone. One of them was a kid at university. So look, it's hard. But considering the service that these podcasts, yours and mine, are doing for the listeners, one just keeps on going. So the show is Trish Wood is Critical. It's Apple, Spotify, Stitcher. It's on, it's audio only. We have a YouTube channel too, where we drop little bits of this and that, something called Midweek Meltdown, which is a little commentary I do if I'm too mad to wait till Friday about something. and my website is trishwoodpodcast.com. So you can go there too and see a bit more about my background and that sort of thing.
I might have to do a copycat of the Midweek Meltdown because I'm the same. I can never get. There's always this gap between episodes. I used to do a daily show, but now it's having had a baby, it's not so easy. So, but I might need to do a Midweek Meltdown to keep things flowing.
Well, your head's spinning, right? You're like, oh, I've got to say that. I've got to make a note of that. So I get it out like Tuesday or Wednesday, and then we usually record the show on Thursday or Friday for a Friday night drop. Sometimes we do a show on Wednesday too. We've done that. But here's how COVID crazy we are. I have an interview with Oliver Stone, a 3-time Oscar winner, that we haven't been able to schedule because we're doing COVID. Now with the emergencies, it's like, oh, sorry, Oliver. But look, he's actually quite important because he's talking about the Kennedy assassination in a way that suggests he's got some pretty good evidence. That kind of case closed, which does apply a bit to what we're going through now. But I just feel, and I'm sure you do too, that not discussing this as it plays out in real time is a disservice in a sense to our listeners, right? We got to keep on going.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
And then we'll all meet at the Rancho La Puerta or some fancy spa in Mexico for like a month of recovery.
Yes. Good idea. I'll take your for it. Well, Trish, it's been an absolute pleasure. Please tell the audience, thank you for watching and listening to this, whether you're watching live or in the replay. Please do hit the share button. This is a powerful conversation. It's important that we share the stories of what's happening around the world. We experience this in our own kind of little bubble of the nations that we live in. But this is happening everywhere. And I think it's really important that we get this global picture. So please hit that share button. Do check out Trish's podcast. Go to trishwoodpodcast.com. It's on all the major platforms. And if you haven't done so already, please just take 1 minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, enter your name and email, and join our mailing list. I've been Dan Astin-Gregory. We've been here today with Trish Wood. What a powerful conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again on our next episode.